Chapter 8 of She and Allan.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain.
For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. She and Allan by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 8. Pursuit. After all, we did not get away much before noon, because first there was a great deal to be done. To begin with, the loads had to be arranged. These consisted largely of ammunition, everything else being cut down to an irreducible minimum. To carry them we took 2 donkeys there were on the place, also half a dozen pack oxen, all of which animals were supposed to be salted, that is, to have suffered and recovered from every kind of sickness, including the bite of the deadly tsetse fly. I suspected, it is true, that they would not be proof against further attacks, still I hoped that they would last for some time, as indeed proved to be the case. In the event of the beasts failing us, we took also 10 of the best of those Strathmuir men who had accompanied us on the sea cow trip, to serve as bearers when it became necessary. It cannot be said that these snuff and butter fellows, for most if not all of them had some dash of white blood in their veins, were exactly willing volunteers. Indeed, if a choice had been left to them, they would, I think, have declined this adventure. But there was no choice. Their master, Robertson, ordered them to come, and after a glance at the Zulus they concluded that the command was one which would be enforced, and that if they stopped behind it would not be as living men. Also some of them had lost wives and children in the slaughter, which, if they were not very brave, filled them with a desire for revenge. Lastly, they could all shoot after a fashion and had good rifles. Moreover, if I may say so, I think that they put confidence in my leadership. So they made the best of a bad business and got themselves ready. Then arrangements must be made about the carrying on of the farm and store during our absence. These, together with my waggon and oxen, were put in the charge of Thomaso, since there was no one else who could be trusted at all. A very battered and crestfallen Thomaso, by the way. When he heard of it he was much relieved, since I think he feared lest he also should be expected to take part in the hunt of the Amahagger man-eaters. Also it may have occurred to him that in all probability none of us would ever come back at all, in which case by a process of natural devolution he might find himself the owner of the business and much valuable property. However, he swore by sundry saints, for Thomaso was nominally a Catholic, that he would look after everything as though it were his own, as no doubt he hoped it might become. "Hearken, fat pig," said Umslopogaas, Hans obligingly translating, so that there might be no mistake. "If I come back, and come back I shall, who travel with the Great Medicine, and find even one of the cattle of the White Lord, Macumazahn, Watcher by Night, missing, or one article stolen from his waggon, or the fields of your master not cultivated, or his goods wasted, I swear by the Axe that I will hew you into pieces with the axe. Yes, if to do it I have to hunt you from where the sun rises to where it sets, and down the length of the night between. Do you understand, fat pig, deserter of women and children, who to save yourself could run faster than a buck?" Thomaso replied that he understood very clearly indeed, and that Heaven helping him, all should be kept safe and sound. Still I was sure that in his manly heart he was promising great gifts to the saints if they would so arrange matters that Umslopogaas and his axe were never seen at Strathmuir again, and reflecting that after all the Amahagger had their uses. However, as I did not trust him in the least, much against their will, I left my driver and voorlooper to guard my belongings. At last we did get off, pursued by the fervent blessings of Thomaso and the prayers of the others that we would avenge their murdered relatives. We were a curious and motley procession. First went Hans, because at following a spoor he was, I believe, almost unequalled in Africa, and with him Umslopogaas and three of his Zulus to guard against surprise. These were followed by Captain Robertson, who seemed to prefer to walk alone and whom I thought it best to leave undisturbed. Then I came, and after me straggled the Strathmuir boys with the pack animals, the cavalcade being closed by the remaining Zulus under the command of Goroko. These walked last, in case any of the mixed bloods should attempt to desert, as we thought it quite probable that they would. Less than an hour's tramp brought us to the bushveld where I feared that our troubles might begin, since if the Amahagger were cunning, they would take advantage of it to confuse or hide their spoor. As it chanced, however, they had done nothing of the sort, and a child could have followed their march. Just before nightfall we came to their first halting place, where they had made a fire and eaten one of the herd of farm goats, which they had driven away with them, although they left the cattle. I suppose because goats are docile and travel well. Hans showed us everything that had happened, where the chair in which Inez was carried was set down, where she and Janee had been allowed to walk that she might stretch her stiff limbs, the dregs of some coffee that evidently Janee had made in a saucepan, and so forth. He even told us the exact number of the Amahagger, which he said totalled 41, including the man whom Inez had wounded. His spoor he distinguished from that of the others both by an occasional drop of blood and because he walked lightly on his right foot, doubtless for the reason that he wished to avoid jarring his wound, which was on that side. At this spot we were obliged to stay till daybreak, since it was impossible to follow the spoor by night, a circumstance that gave the cannibals a great advantage over us. The next 2 days were repetitions of the first, but on the fourth we passed out of the bush veld into the swamp country that bordered the great river. Here our task was still easy, since the Amahagger had followed one of the paths made by the river dwellers, who had their habitations on mounds, though whether these were natural or artificial I am not sure, and sometimes on floating islands. On our second day in the reeds we came upon a sad sight. To our left stood one of these mound villages, if a village it could be called, since it consisted only of 4 or 5 huts inhabited perhaps by 20 people. We went up to it to obtain information, and stumbled across the body of an old man lying in the pathway. A few yards further on we found the ashes of a big fire, and by it such remains as we had seen at Strathmuir. Here there had been another cannibal feast. The miserable huts were empty, but as at Strathmuir had not been burnt. We were going away when the acute ears of Hans caught the sound of groans. We searched about, and in a clump of reeds near the foot of the mound we found an old woman with a great spear wound just above her skinny thigh, piercing deep into the vitals, but of a nature which is not immediately mortal. One of Robertson's people, who understood the language of these swamp dwellers well, spoke to her. She told him that she wanted water. It was brought and she drank copiously. Then in an answer to his question she began to talk. She said that the Amahagger had attacked the village and killed all who could not escape. They had eaten a young woman and 3 children. She had been wounded by a spear and fled away into the place where we found her, where none of them took the trouble to follow her, as she was not worth eating. By my direction the man asked her whether she knew anything of these Amahagger. She replied that her grandfathers had, though she had heard nothing of them since she was a child, which must have been 70 years before. They were a fierce people who lived far up north across the great river, the remnants of a race that had once ruled the world. Her grandfathers used to say that they were not always cannibals, but had become so long before because of a lack of food, and now had acquired the taste. It was for this purpose that they still raided, to get other people to eat, since their ruler would not allow them to eat one another. The flesh of cattle they did not care for, although they had plenty of them, but sometimes they ate